All rise. This Commission of Inquiry is now open. Commissioner James Igloliorte presiding as Commissioner. Please be seated.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. The witness this morning will be a short day. I expect we'll be, in all likelihood, we'll be done by about 11, and then I'll have a brief chat about what we'll be doing tomorrow. Today we'll be hearing from Mr. Merv Wiseman of the Concerned Citizens for Search and Rescue. He will, as has been our practice, the direct evidence will come out through his counsel, Mr. Darren O'Keefe. Then we'll have a quick break. Then we may hear from another witness, but first, Mr. Wiseman. So, Mr. O'Keefe, perhaps you can take the floor.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Button. My name is Darren O'Keefe, and I represent the Concerned Citizens for Search and Rescue. The Concerned Citizens for Search and Rescue are a group of like-minded individuals who've been involved in search and rescue over the past number of decades, and include as their chairman, our witness here today, Mr. Mervyn Wiseman. Others in the group include Joanna Ryan Guy, Captain Wilford Bartlett, who's also here today, and some others. The mandate of the group was set out on a website that they established last year, and they did so in direct response to this inquiry, with the intention of participating in this inquiry. And it's a matter of public record that the group had indicated very early on that they wished to be heard here to express some concerns and hopefully some constructive comments on search and rescue in the province. Given and obviously aware of the mandate of this inquiry and the I guess the restrictions of this inquiry. The Concerned Citizens Group's mandate, as per their website, is to achieve through citizen advocacy a superior, world-class, 24/7 search and rescue system, provincially and nationally, that excels at saving lives at risk on land and sea, and one that is reflective of unique regional needs associated with geography, culture, language, climatic characteristics, as well as having the capacity to adapt to an ever-changing environment. Mr. Commissioner, before we get into Mr. Wiseman's comments, my approach here this morning is to basically guide him through his experience. He'll give an introduction in terms of his working experience. He was the search and rescue coordinator at the Marine Center in St. John's for over 20 years. I will say before we start, we're obviously cognizant of and aware of the jurisdictional limitations of this inquiry. And we're aware that this is a provincial inquiry looking at ground search and rescue. So that fact is certainly not lost on us. In Mr. Wiseman's evidence here today, or testimony here today, he will draw on his experience from the marine perspective and from the land perspective, and hopefully with a view to providing insight in terms of how things may be done differently or things may be done better. And that's the goal of his submissions today, as I understand it. But I just wanted to note up front that we are aware of the sensitivities around jurisdiction and the parties in the room. We know their concerns. So we'll do the best we can to make sure that his evidence is relevant and within the confines of what we're here to achieve. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wiseman and allow him to introduce himself, and then to facilitate his evidence, I will ask a few sort of broad questions, and obviously then it'll be up to other council and participants to ask follow-up questions as they see fit, obviously subject to your direction, Mr. Commissioner. So I'll pass it to Mr. Wiseman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Wiseman, before you begin. I appreciate the candor in setting out what might be testimony respecting extra jurisdictional points. I think one of the hallmarks of this open process, as we've seen up to this point, is the cooperation from Canada and its willingness to share for the specific searches that have been conducted involving both the federal governments and the province, that there is, as Mr. Smith has pointed out, a fair degree of interoperability in ensuring that things work. And we have seen as well in the history of changes since at least 2012 that there is becoming a sense of openness in how these matters are conducted. So I think we should extend to you the utmost professional courtesy and give you a bit of leeway, recognizing that the ultimate aim of the final report is to see how we can make changes that will improve ground search and rescue, recognizing that in almost every situation we've seen, there has to be a fair degree of cooperation involving federal resources and provincial resources as we proceed. So in that light, I'm quite prepared to hear what your witness has to say.
And Mr. Commissioner, if I may, before I start, I would be remiss if I didn't mention two other points. I apologize, I should have mentioned them a moment ago. First point is we came into the inquiry later than I should say later than some of the other parties, and we this morning will try as much as we can not to cover issues or delve into topics that have likely been covered in the other sessions with some degree of detail. And secondly, we try to be respectful and courteous of all parties in how we frame the issues. So, without any further comments from me, I'll pass it over to Mr. Wiseman.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you for your comments, and with respect to all the other participants, legal counsel and family. Thank you for the opportunity that you've given me here this morning. I'll just give you a little bit of my background in a second, but I just wanted to say, in keeping with I guess the goals and objectives of our group, the Concerned Citizens. It's important for us, I think, and important for the public, I think, to at least have a voice, which we hope to be able to give. And in saying that, I want to be able to say that we're also not necessarily confined to talking, if you will, but to listening. And I've listened intently since coming here Monday and listening to all the testimony. And we have learned a lot. We have learned an awful lot. The Ground Search and Rescue President, Mr. Blackmore, I mean, the testimony has been extremely beneficial. And I must say, I think Mr. Blackmore should definitely get the Order of Canada, that's for sure, for all his volunteer work. And likewise, the testimony from, and a few things we've heard from the family has been very appreciative, and I certainly appreciate hearing that. I'm a retired search and rescue, maritime search and rescue coordinator. I worked at the Marine Rescue Subcenter in St. John's, and I've been retired since 2012, actually the same year that we had the Burton Winters case. I've certainly followed a lot of those proceedings, but I've also followed a lot of other issues and proceedings around search and rescue. And again, from a public standpoint, from the perspective of trying to contribute in a meaningful way, we've certainly learned the power of advocacy and what that means. And I guess my best example was with the Marine Rescue Subcenter. I retired in 2012 because basically the Rescue Subcenter closed, and that's it. We were out of a job. But fortunately for me, I was at the age where I could retire. But certainly in the subsequent years after that, there was an aggressive campaign, public campaign, in many fashions to get the Marine Rescue Subcenter reopened, which we did achieve, I believe, to a large degree because of our advocacy. And 2016, 2017, it reopened again. I had 35 years with the Canadian Coast Guard, starting in 1977. And my first 15 years was spent as a vessel traffic services expert, I guess, if you want to call it that. And within that profession of the Coast Guard, I served as a supervisor here in St. John's with St. John's Traffic, and also administering a lot of the regulations pertaining to shipping in and out of Canadian waters. And also I spent 4 navigation seasons in Iqaluit, working with the sea lift operations and also screening vessels coming in and out of the Arctic with regard to their compliance with various regulations, and also facilitating ships routing through ice navigation, things of that sort, and also facilitating collaboratively with other players at times, such as the JRCCs, when search and rescue cases needed to be put in effect. So we were part of that service from the north. Of course, answering to the people with mandates such as the JRCCs. But then for the last 20 years, I applied and within the system, and I was a maritime search and rescue coordinator along with that. My training leading up to that, of course, the Canadian Coast Guard was in nautical science, the Marine Institute, and I am a certified ship's officer. But I didn't go to sea much after, because the kind of work that I did with Coast Guard was land-based. So that's a little bit of the history of my background.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner, we've heard Mr. Wiseman's background. As he's noted, his background is primarily in marine. First question I wanted to ask Mr. Wiseman to facilitate this discussion this morning is to ask him to draw on that experience in marine search and rescue and ask Mr. Wiseman whether he can offer comments to this commission on how, in his view, based on his experience, things may be done better with ground search and rescue. And before I pass the mic back, it's my understanding, and Mr. Wiseman can speak about this, that firstly, part of the group's submissions prior to our appearance today to this commission and to the government has been that they acknowledge what they call a gray area or an overlap area between the land-based search and rescue missions that are conducted in this province and the marine-based. And this is something that we raised in passing in some of our questions earlier this week, but I think it's something that Mr. Wiseman will speak about and something that we all acknowledge, being on an island surrounded by water, obviously, and having the majority of our communities on the coast. There's obviously a significant overlap in how we live our lives from a geographic perspective with the land-based searching and marine searching. So simply put, Commissioner, the question I'm going to ask Mr. Wiseman is, drawing on his experience in marine search and rescue, if he could offer his perspective on how things may be done better with ground search and rescue.
Thank you. I would say right up front, I believe rescue coordination and the gold standard for rescue coordination in this country is from a maritime search and rescue standpoint. I've had experience in my capacity as a rescue coordinator to work with ground search and rescue in what we would call, in the beginning, it was called aid to civil authority. Some classifications change, and going to get hung up on definitions or classifications, but I think we've come to know it today as humanitarian cases. One of the first things that strikes me is and I think this relates to some part of the presentation that Mr. Smith had given earlier the week about command and control, and about the efficiency and the immediacy of being able to act under some very difficult circumstances involving life and death. And if I could quote again the Senate report that talked about and entitled their study, "Every Minute Counts." And I would agree that with a comment that was made yesterday that really it's every second counts. I've had cases, too many cases to remember, where if we'd have had another minute, maybe two, we would have saved a life. I've seen many cases where if we hadn't got there that particular minute, then a life wouldn't have been saved, but a life was saved. I think the overriding part about maritime search and rescue, and when I say it's a gold standard, is that maritime search and rescue coordinators are really empowered to affect the kind of and respond in a way that they're governed by a legislative framework, if you will, under the Canada Shipping Act. It allows a rescue coordinator, and this old decision-making matrix, for example, and I'll just give a little example of the contrast between what would happen in a ground search and rescue situation and with maritime rescue coordination. The decision-making matrix and that command and control begins with the search and rescue coordinator. If a vessel is on fire or sinking anywhere within our mandated period of location of coordination, then as a rescue coordinator, I have the empowerment, the authority, without consulting any levels of the management structure, to proceed and direct resources to do the kinds of things that we would want to resolve that situation. It would mean that if there's a vessel of opportunity that's close by, that we can direct them to proceed, to assist. We can give all kinds of instructions that's delineated under the Canada Shipping Act. That a level of empowerment is there. It also gives us the empowerment to act as coordinators and to proceed as we see fit with government resources, primary resources, secondary resources, all the things that we've heard about here this week. So there's that immediate response, quick and efficient. And there's also the capacity and the ability of maritime rescue coordinators to conduct the search planning and to really be at the apex, if you will, of that command and control, and to be able to, and having a full situational awareness of every possible resource that could work in that particular situation is an ongoing effort, 24/7. And that's, I guess, reinforced, that ability and that expertise and the training that we have is reinforced by the fact that we do this as a maritime rescue coordinator. We do this on a continuous basis, many times 12, 15, 20 times a day. Some days there's less, some days there's more. So that level of experience that comes with that allows you to perfect your profession to the point where it becomes very efficient. When I receive another, by way of an example, when I receive a call for help from the police, so all of a sudden we're now switching to a ground search and rescue effort. It may have been, and quite often we had cases where someone have fell off the cliff here on Signal Hill. It's happened a number of times. And so the fire and emergency services are responding, police on scene. There's, obviously they're in control of this case. They're the lead agency and so on. But because of this, the coastline and the sea, they're coming to me as a rescue coordinator asking, can we have the assistance of one of your Coast Guard vessels that we know is in the area or might be in the area, whatever the case might be, a fast rescue craft and so on and so forth. So I take that request, but as a rescue coordinator in that situation, because it's now in a humanitarian situation with another aid agency, then I have no authority as a rescue coordinator to make the kinds of decisions that I just illustrated to you that I could. I now have to follow my chain of command and proceed to my officer in charge to get permission to proceed with that. With that request. I do not have that authority. Once the authority is achieved, of course, then we engage, and but not in a lead role, of course, but we engage and we assist, and we send our fast rescue craft, if that's what it might be, and we give them the kinds of guidance and the tasking and search areas and all the search planning that's needed in collaboration with the police, who is, of course, the lead agency. I have seen examples where, just to take you away from the Signal Hill scenario, where a Coast Guard vessel has been requested, for example, in an area remote from here, and it's a legitimate request from the RCMP. They've seen the need to help with a shoreline search, again, by way of an example. And so I've gone to my chain of command to pass that request along. Chain of command has got to take a few minutes to consult his superior about whether or not he can take the vessel off of the program where he might be involved in fisheries patrol, high-level fisheries patrol, or buoy tendering, if you will, AIDS navigation program. And I've seen that chain of command sometimes move up through different levels that have taken quite a period of time. And very frustrating as a rescue coordinator to have to sit and watch. And I think if I could use the words of Harry Blackmore that I seen quoted earlier this week in his testimony, that sometimes the request for assistance for humanitarian support becomes very convoluted. I think these words are very appropriate in cases like that. I don't want to say that it's in all cases. We try to expedite as quickly and efficiency as we can. But my experience was in the past not great when it comes to a command and control situation starting to get diluted or not being accommodated because other players in other positions have had to make a decision about an important resource that could save a life. So I think, that's the big contrast. I did have an example that I wanted to reference. I'm not sure if I consult with my legal counsel on the Brumfield case, that if I could proceed with that.
Go ahead, and if the commissioner doesn't want to hear it, he'll tell you.
I got no problem with that.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the cases that stands out for me a lot, especially in light of the Burton Winters situation, and by way of an example again, just to illustrate a point, is an individual called Todd Brumfield from Makuvik. In June of 2011, about 7 months, I guess, or so, before the Burton Winters case, I came on duty from a midnight shift at 7 p.m. Shortly after, about 5 minutes later, I received a call from Todd Brumfield's wife, Emma Kuvik, who had talked to her husband, Todd, by satellite telephone. He had been marooned on Cape Harrison, about 40 nautical miles or so from Makuvik. And he had been marooned there with 2 of his companions. They'd gone ashore, they were taken on water. They were wet. They were fortunate in that they were able to keep their satellite telephone with them, and it didn't become defective through the process of them being in the water. So when his wife Ruth called me, of course I immediately recognized that this is a maritime search and rescue matter, so I could act immediately on what the need was. Having a full situational awareness of resources that would be needed to effect this rescue, I quickly recognized that we had no maritime resources, so we needed aircraft support. So I very quickly got on the phone with the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, because they are the lead authority on this. Anything to do with aircraft deployment would be from the JRCC Halifax. I won't go into the full relationship between the Marine Rescue Subcenter and the JRCC, but needless to say that if there's any description that I could give about how close we are literally joined at the hip when it comes to rescue coordination, and that continuous open mic is there between the Rescue Coordination Center, the JRCC, and ourselves as Maritime Rescue Coordinators. We are the Maritime Rescue Subcenter, as they have deemed us, who reports on a continuous basis and collaborates on a continuous basis with the JRCC. And so in this particular case, there's a quick briefing, as in all cases. There's a quick briefing of the air controller on duty, and we quickly established who will be the search mission coordinator, the SMC as we call it. We established very clearly who would take the lead on this case, and in this situation, we quickly agreed, for obvious reason, that I would, as a rescue coordinator in St. John's, proceed with what was necessary in being the command and control coordinator in this particular case. My first request was for the Cormorant in Gander, because that's what my assessment and the air coordinator concurred with that we should have a Cormorant at a Gander as quickly as possible. And so I went back online with Mrs. Brumfield to indicate that we had a Cormorant the crew being recalled to duty to take on that mission. And gathered a bit more information from that, and then went back again to the JRCC to talk more about top cover. What we call top cover is maybe a technical term. In other words, that to have the helicopter proceed, to that kind of a location in particular, it would need the support of a Hercules aircraft. So I again asked to have Hercules aircraft engaged out of Greenwood. And so that's quite simply was the mission. And from just slightly after 7 o'clock until about midnight, these resources arrived on scene. And the top cover, the Hercules, arrived just about the same time as the helicopter, acting, of course, as a platform for communications and searching to locate if they had to, but illumination affecting all the illumination requirements, flare droppings and things like that. Very shortly, within a half an hour, the rescue was achieved, and the 3 individuals were airlifted to Makuvik, and around 2 o'clock in the morning, they were home, warm, drinking coffee with their families. So I think that is, for me, it is an illustration, I think, of being able to respond with the very best resource and the very best service that we had available, and having that command and control and situational awareness all coming together and being able to affect, that kind of a search without having to involve all the peripherals, bringing in different individuals to take the time with great respect to try to do what they feel was best. I can only conjecture, and I guess it's not the place to conjecture, that had this call taken a different route, if it was defined as a ground search and rescue situation, that it may have taken a different route. They were on land, but because of the way we proceed with certain definitions and the way they landed on Cape Harrison, we deemed that to be, without question, no issues with regard to the fact that we deemed this to be a maritime search and rescue. Had it been a ground search and rescue, then I think we can see that the police in Makuvik would have been involved. They may have taken a different route. They may have considered their own options, calling their own particular people in authority to requisition resources to exhaust that avenue, that effort, and so on, and may have ultimately ended up going to the JRCC in a humanitarian kind of scenario, asking for resources. It may have turned out exactly the same thing, but there's this intermediate process, I think, that I think has to be considered as somewhat of an impediment. So I'll conclude that little example by trying to fit this into some of the presentation that I observed from Mr. Smith, and when he talked about command and control and having that authority to do things and having the efficiency and the utility to be able to do it. And I know that Mr. Smith as well talked about, a good EOC, Emergency Operations Center, and having that infrastructural arrangement to ensure that if it was not a maritime search and rescue case, that we could at least try to receive that level of equivalency. So that's why I make that point, that there is a contrast and there is a difference, and I think quite often can be an impediment to achieving the kind of outcome that we would want.
Mr. Wiseman, I'd heard you mention before the person who's in need of search and rescue services in the moment they need those services are not concerned whether it's the provincial government or the federal government or who it is that comes to their aid. They're just seeking aid in that moment. And in the context of the evidence that you just gave, could you offer any perspective on, I guess, what I would call the artificiality of the land versus marine divide that we experience in this province, and how perhaps we could work towards a more streamlined process going forward that acknowledges that what we would call artificial distinction?
Yeah, well, certainly not an easy one to deal with. They're obviously we're aware of jurisdictional issues, so that division of authority and enabling powers and legislation to do things all comes into play. I mean, if we were to use the model of which I consider to be the gold plate model of rescue coordination from the maritime environment. I mean, we in Canada, the level of search and rescue cases from a maritime standpoint is well in excess of 60%. I always heard, and we were using the figure of in excess of 80%. I noticed in the Senate report of 2018, when every minute counts, that the level of maritime search and rescue cases that needed to be coordinated was between 60 and 65% maritime. So that means there's you know, in the order of upwards of 40% that's ground search and rescue. Could we have some level of consistency or service by having the rescue coordination and having some enabling MOU, if you will, say that rescue coordinators would take on the same coordinating role and responsibility for ground search and rescue as it would with maritime search and rescue, in the name of efficiency, or at least, as I said before, the alternate to that would be to have, you know, the kind of framework that Mr. Smith has been giving in his presentations on a very efficient and active EOC, Emergency Operations Center, with the right level of expertise and so on that we should have. I mean, I have to take. I read one of the case studies that came out of the JRCC with regard to the Burton Winters case. It's one of the exhibits. I think it's maybe 97, 98. And I saw at one point where they had referenced the EO Emergency Operations Center in St. John's in Newfoundland had requested resources from the JRCC, and the discussion had come up about Casera. And the person that was on the other line from the province didn't know what Casera was. And I'm thinking, you know, that would never be a situation where a maritime rescue coordinator wouldn't know and be infinitely and intimately familiar with all of the significant players. And I think that speaks to a concern that we would have as concerned citizens, that we would have some inadequacy in our system where a person in a position looking for the right kind of resource for the right kind of a situation wouldn't be aware of an agency like Casera. So I think, you know, from the point of view of the person that's out there in trouble, whether it's on a skidoo or whether it's in a vessel or whatever the case might be, it seems to me the expectation would be from that person, clearly from that person, and from the public in general, that there should be and there must be an entitlement to the same level of service that's afforded to other Canadians, if you will, and that the best resource that's needed for that particular situation is available. And I can't help but talk about the issues of resources from a secondary and a primary standpoint. And one of the things that's come up often from our standpoint is really the lack of primary capacity in northern areas. It came up in the Senate report. You know, I think it's a good point of reference, good terms of reference about some of the concerns and the needs that's in our northern areas. It came up during the case in Labrador just last week when we lost the two individuals at sea. It was a huge public debate about the lack of primary resources in Labrador. Harry Blackmore mentioned yesterday that he believes there should be primary resources in Deer Lake and in Goose Bay, to name a few. Well, you know, there can be debate around that, but it is distressing to see that there's no primary search and rescue capacity in Goose Bay in particular to be able to service the Labrador region. And I think that was illustrated really in the Burton Winters case, where the best we had to offer in this country was not available to Labrador. And we can talk about all the nuances around that, but generally speaking, the best and most capable resources. And you know, when I think about a primary search and rescue unit like the 103 in Gander, and I think about the Cormorant and the ability of that aircraft, and that's why we have it, and that's why we paid the billions of dollars to have it, the capabilities related to endurance.
Excuse me, Commissioner, I'm not sure now if we are going down a road which is appropriate. I think now we're basically talking about how the federal government should be spending its money in terms of primary and secondary assets. I'm not sure. I appreciate the other point he's making, but again, I mean, we asked the federal government to participate in this, basically to address humanitarian assistance, and I'm not sure at this point that we are now still within ground search and rescue.
I'll allow comments all around, please, from council.
Mark Freeman for Justice Canada. I mean, we're inclined to agree with Mr. Ralph, obviously, but I've been taking the cues from Inquiry Council and from yourself, Mr. Commissioner, this morning, from your comments as we began, and you were essentially asking us to give breadth and respect to the witness as much as possible, and I'm more than confident that you know the terms of reference and what the scope of this inquiry is and isn't. And if you're prepared to hear it or interested in hearing it, that's okay. But again, the placement of air assets federally is not part of this inquiry. But that's not to say that potentially the placement of provincial air assets in Deer Lake and Corner Brook provided by Cougar, hypothetically, as we heard about yesterday, couldn't be something that you might be thinking about. So if that's, if we're just talking about where our assets should be and not who should be buying them or placing them or why or when, then that may be something you are prepared to hear about. So like I said, I'm not going to full-throated objection, just would caution some attention to the terms of reference when it comes to this, how much weight you're giving some of this information.
Mr. Budden and then Mr. O'Keefe.
I think that Mr. Freeman's comments are accurate. The call was for a primary resource, as I understood Mr. Wiseman. I think there are other aspects of Mr. Wiseman's evidence that perhaps can be challenged on Mr. Ralph's basis, but as I took Mr. Blackmore's call and perhaps Mr. Wiseman's echoing of it, they don't really care who puts those resources in place. They simply ask that a primary resource be put in place, so in which case it seems to be within the scope of this inquiry.
Oh, that's fine. If that's because I understood, because the primary and secondary.
Mr. Williams, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Again, you know, the tenor in which Mr. Wiseman's counsel introduced what his evidence was going to be, I think was in keeping with the mandate of the inquiry, in the sense that I think it's enlightening to hear from individuals, while we know what the jurisdictional issues are, who have experience, obviously, as Mr. Wiseman does, in both marine and ground rescue, because often their resources are called in. So I see his evidence, at least to date, as being very holistic in the sense of he's looking at the system as a whole. He's speaking of issues that could benefit the system. I mean, if we get into saying we got to put, you know, federal resources here and provincial resources here, maybe there might be some argument, but that's not where I see his evidence at this point, or where I see it going.
And sorry, Mr. Ralph, go ahead.
That's fine. No, because I understood primary had a certain meaning, the meaning was in relation to the JRCC, and that there's really, those words have no meaning with regard to ground search and rescue. That it is, those are words, primary and secondary, deal with federal policy. So again, I don't think that language, and I appreciate it, if the point is that there should be a helicopter in Goose Bay that has a similar sort of I guess, ability to respond as defined by primary, then I guess that's a different question. But it seems to me when you're using language like primary or secondary, you are dealing with language that's about federal policy.
Mr. Commissioner, I'll make just a couple of comments. First comment that I'll make is that the evidence that Mr. Wiseman is giving from his experience and the comments that he's making, I didn't hear that evidence as him trying to suggest that there should be an additional expense incurred by the federal government or the provincial government. In fact, I think if he was to finish his evidence, he would have suggested that it could, in fact, be the provincial government who could take on a revised search and rescue program and invest the money in their own resources, which is certainly conceivable, notwithstanding what budgetary limitations may be out there, but it's certainly conceivable that that could be done, or alternatively, it's conceivable that one of the companies that we heard from yesterday could be contracted to provide those resources. On this second point regarding the definition of primary resources, secondary resources, I'll mention very briefly exhibit number 9. I don't have to pull it up because I don't want to get into the content, but the definition of, and the meaning and role of primary resources versus secondary resources. In fact, our client raised that in the initial submissions on the working paper back in August, calling for a better definition of those terms and how they're applied to search and rescue. So while I appreciate my learned friend's comments regarding not throwing terms around loosely that may have other implications, I think it may be in the context, and I'll let Mr. Wiseman speak again now, in the context of a submission here today and deliberations following these hearings and recommendations, it may be appropriate to review those terms and to see what terms are applicable, going forward, and how we use those definitions and those terms in talking and having an open dialogue about search and rescue. So take the point that as those terms are used currently, they may have certain connotations and may have certain definitions associated. But if I understand Mr. Wiseman's evidence, what he's essentially trying to say is, when he talks about primary resources, is essentially a direct access resource available within the province. So, so that's it. Those would be my comments.
Thank you. Yes, so we're dealing with an objection by the province in assistance of the federal government with respect to how we delineate what this commission can talk about, what it can recommend, what it can receive as evidence in coming to those conclusions. And the objection specifically relates to the witness beginning to stray into areas where we are now talking about how the federal government should act or should spend money or should arrange certain kinds of possibly non-ground search and rescue circumstances. I think it's a valid point to raise as a caution. There's no question. I believe that even as counsel for Mr. Wiseman for the Concerned Citizens opened, that there are areas we are simply not going to be able to make any recommendations on. That there are areas that really, while we talk about them, will have no lasting benefit for this inquiry. Nonetheless, we have seen that everyone desires a bit of a paradigm shift now in how ground search and rescue has traditionally operated and how it should now move forward in light of different circumstances. For example, we accept that health services should become a large part of how ground search and rescue works, that mental health is vitally important. We've seen other examples during the course of this commission where the practices and procedures may need to be challenged. So I think that the witness is simply bringing up other ways of looking at the way the world has worked in ground search and rescue and the way that it may work more efficiently going forward. I agree that we should, after having invited Canada to sit in on this these provincially grounded hearings, that we should offer them the greatest deference in ensuring that we, after having invited them to come here and participate, then we suddenly turn around and make life very difficult for them, in the sense that we somehow change the rules about what we had decided to talk about. Nonetheless, the spirit of Mr. Wiseman's comments are really quite important for deliberations by this inquiry, and clearly he is offering hugely experienced comments about what he has done and what he has observed, and what, as he refers to Mr. Smith's own groundwork as an expert, the Commission may want to consider in its final recommendations. So I think we've gone down the path of talking about the kind of resources that might be placed or should be placed by the province versus the federal government. I think that what Mr. Ralph has raised is a good caution, but in fact, we are quite ready to move on and try to stay within the parameters. So there's really no harm being done up to this point to how the recommendations will impact on what we say. And what Mr. Wiseman is saying is quite enlightening. So I'm prepared to continue giving your client that caution. I'm sure he's at the point of getting close to his main dissertation anyway. So let's continue on.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you very much for that explanation. And if I could just, on the primary versus secondary piece, I really meant it in a generic sense and really not in the context of a federal piece. Obviously, the federal government and the provincial government, and who's into search and rescue, deployment of resources and so on, that they recognize from a generic standpoint the point that I'm talking about. I mean, quite clearly, a primary search and rescue unit, whether it's federal, provincial, or whatever it might be, just brings with it a level of characteristics different from secondary. It means that there has to be standards on training that's there, that has to be present all the time. There has to be a standby posture, for example. And I'm really was going kind of in the direction of the presentation that I saw yesterday, where there was, like, I was very impressed with what Provincial Airlines PAL to offer in terms of services. Very impressed with Kruger and what they had to offer. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that the federal government, within the scope of its search and rescue mandate, has the responsibility to take on financial, all the financial implications and things that go with that. I mean, I think there was, from what I could see yesterday, it was really a pitch to the province to take on this a very valuable kind of a resource. And, especially the Kruger. I mean, the Kruger crews and the craft that they have, it's coming very, very close to some of the best standards we have. I mean, I really want to be complimentary to what's in Gander with the Cormorant, for example, and the search and rescue technicians that they have. Like, knowing what I know about search and rescue technicians, I would put my life in the hands of a SARTEC, as we call them, quicker than I would a surgeon. They're just heroes in my mind, and so all that capacity is there. But certainly the Kruger service is there. So I think that's a consideration, that in lieu of and in consideration of the huge geographical spread that we have in Labrador, in particular on this one, that the Commission would take under advisement something that's evolving. And when we go back to the Senate report, they had done work towards trends that was evolving and had projected that the frequency of need in northern areas, including the Arctic, including Labrador, was increasing and was going to continue to increase. So in light of all that, that's really the point that I wanted to make. So maybe you can get me back on track here.
I'll do my best. We don't have a lot more ground to cover, Mr. Commissioner. The main topics that I understand Concerned Citizens Group wanted to advance have more or less been covered in what we've heard. I think as a final question, I'll ask Mr. Wiseman about, if he could summarize in sort of point form from his group's perspective what they feel, or what they think, I should say, should be done going forward to improve things. And then I think we'll be finished, and other council can ask whatever questions they wish. So, Mr. Wiseman, I guess there's your opportunity for, in summary, if there's other points that you wish to raise, I think you certainly can. But my question to you would be, if you could inform everyone here today in this commission, if you could sort of enumerate in point form, what do you believe should be considered by this commission in terms of improving ground search and rescue going forward?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly appreciate that, and I think one of the overarching things in summary to all this, one of the overarching things that I've observed through testimony, Mr. Blackmore, the police, and others, and certainly the presentation made by Mr. Smith, was this overarching effort to cooperate and to collaborate, the goodwill that's out there. And oftentimes, if in lieu of levels of resources and expertise, sometimes the goodwill that's there have pushed things to a successful conclusion lots of times. And again, my experience in a maritime environment is that the level of collaboration between internationally, for example, between the United States and Canada, between Japan and Canada, it doesn't matter where it is, England, whatever the case might be, is absolutely staggering. There's treaties, there's bilateral agreements, there's exchange of resources, there's all kinds of things. So I'm just thinking that if we can have that level of collaboration and effort and coordination to achieve the goals and objectives of saving lives, then certainly we should be able to have a high level, an enhanced level of collaboration among our provinces. We've got from observing from Mr. Smith's presentation and Harry Blackmore's presentation, the differences that we have among provinces, and wouldn't it be great to have almost a generic approach, if you will, consistent approach. I know we're trying to achieve that, so I would just use the international environment as an example of that, and something to consider and to look at. But overall, I think the levels of efficiency that, as I spoke about, that can be achieved, and the levels of that all important command and control by having good rescue coordination, and have the infrastructure that rescue coordination is done from, a good emergency operations center, a good EOC, if you will, is infinitely important. And again, without belaboring the point of resources and the level of services, that's an entitlement to all of us, no matter where we are in Canada, no matter where we are in this province. That level of entitlement should and must be achieved for all, and not just for a few. That we should not have this difference in services, and that we need to strive to achieve that. And that's where I would make the point about covering, I believe, it's an area of deficiency from provincial or federal standpoint, whatever standpoint you would talk about, this area of deficiency that continues to exist and manifest itself in Labrador in particular, and having a primary search and rescue unit in Goose Bay, I think, would solve a lot of that. Thank you.
Okay, I just have two quick follow-up points, just to make sure that everyone understands, I guess, what I understand your submissions to be. You had mentioned in your submissions, in your experience as Maritime Search and Rescue Coordinator, that you had delegated authority, if you will, through the Canada Shipping Act. Is it your suggestion, Mr. Wiseman, that there should be a similar type legislative framework put in place for ground search and rescue in this province? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, exactly. I think that that level of empowerment is absolutely necessary. Reinforced with some levels of direction and procedure. It's and again, as a point of reference in some of the things that I've heard, and Mr. Smith can correct me on this one, that it seemed to have been an integral part of the basic criteria that if we were going to achieve the all important command and control, that it needs to have that level of legislative empowerment, and whether it comes from the province or any other jurisdiction, that somehow that must be achieved.
Second point I just want to clarify is you gave the example of international collaboration in the marine context, I believe, to illustrate the broader point that you'd like to see more collaboration, if you will, within ground search and rescue. Did you want to make any comment, Mr. Wiseman, or can you make any comment regarding the suggestion that there should be some form of an overarching, what we call MOU document, or should we be seeking to have some form of overarching framework that includes all stakeholders and outlines their various sort of roles, responsibilities, and more importantly, contributions, as suggested in Mr. Smith's presentation? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, and I was probably a little more robust about that. About achieving that level of collaboration, if you will, if you could use that word, before coming probably to the inquiry, where I'm starting to learn about different levels of services provincially, right across the country, and different levels of jurisdiction, and how you share all that. I mean, I've often said, I'm compelled to say that if rescue coordination, maritime rescue coordination, is the gold standard, how difficult would it be to harmonize that and standardize that with ground search and rescue coordination, and have the services of rescue coordination being performed at a JRCC, in Canada, either Halifax or Trenton or Victoria, and yeah, I understand it would entail significant changes and levels of how you delineate jurisdictional issues, and I'm sure that there'd be issues of cost. I'm sure cost recovery and all these things that you would expect, that I'm no expert at doing, but obviously if we had the level of collaboration, and if we could have some level of agreement signed off through an MOU or legislative arrangement among provinces, that this is what could happen. I mean, that would be an ideal, and I can't help but reflect on that, because I do see quite a different level of that all-important communications, collaboration, command and control coordination that exists between maritime and ground search at the moment.
And the last point, Mr. Commissioner, I just wanted Mr. Wiseman just to clarify his group's position on this primary versus secondary resources. Mr. Wiseman, I understand your position to be that, simply put, you believe there should be primary or direct access resources within the province available to ground search and rescue, as a first point. And as a second point, I understand your group's position is that those services, resources, if you will, should be importantly available in Labrador, given the size of the territory. Can you comment on that?
I think yeah, exactly. And without having to revisit where I started with this level of service, if you will, that's available, and the gold standard of service and so on. It's. I think my observation here, my comments is pretty much in keeping, and I can be corrected on this by Mr. Blackmore, that this is pretty much in keeping with his testimony and his presentations earlier on this week. Because it was raised as well that in order to get the kind of resources that's needed in the moment, in the second, if you will, that there has to be the issue of triage, for example, as to whether or not a federal resource on a humanitarian mission would leave the scene of an injured person, and Mr. Blackmore gave an illustration by saying that a search and rescue technician was halfway down the hoist when he got called off on a maritime medevac situation, and that was it struck me as a little bit odd. We did get an explanation that there was a triage situation, but I think the evidence in the past have shown us that it's not so much triage as it is priority. That it's been seen that the mandate for the resources from a maritime point of view, the priority is to serve the maritime environment. Anything that the ground search and rescue crews can get is kind of luck of the draw in some ways. So the issue of triage, yeah, I don't want to say that it wouldn't be there. Of course, I would never do that, and I'm sure triage does enter the picture. But there has to be a very clear and definitive route to that particular resource without having to consider that there could be a priority in another area rather than send it to the place where a person is indeed in that life and death situation.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner, thank you for your indulgence on some of this subject matter. And my questions are finished. So if any, obviously at your direction, we're finished our questions.
Go ahead, Mr. Budden.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I don't have a whole lot from Mr. Wiseman, and I don't want to cover ground that other council may be more better position to cover, but I do have, I guess, a question or two for you, Mr. Wiseman. As I understand your evidence with respect to a marine search, in your day at least in the substation, you could conceivably take a call directly from an affected person who may be calling from a satellite phone, or in this case, relayed through their wife, and you, as a civil servant in St. John's, would be the person who would make the call to JRCC and ask them to send a helicopter. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that's correct.
And you would have had specific training as to how to appropriately respond, so that, for instance, a person would tell you a situation and you would have training that would say, well, this is a call for a helicopter as opposed to a call for a Coast Guard vessel or something like that.
Yes, that's that situation. I guess if you want to use the word triage, you come to the determination because of your training, your expertise, and your experience, and so on, that this warrants nothing less than an aircraft, fixed wing or rotary, or that a surface resource is simply necessary. It could be a Coast Guard ship that's in the vicinity. Like I say, it could be a vessel of opportunity, and so that empowerment that I explained extends by statute through a legislative process, extends to that the rescue coordinator if you put myself in that position, to say to a vessel of opportunity that maybe a government resource, non-government resource, a private resource, that we are now instructing you to proceed to rescue a person that might be in the water, whatever the case might be. So that
Sure.
is the level of authority.
Now, the ground search and rescue situation, as we've heard, and obviously most ground and rescue won't be probably coastal situation. They'd be berry pickers in the Red Indian Lake area, or perhaps snowmobilers, or a lost child or something. There will be circumstances such as the Winters case, but quite often, perhaps mostly, ground search and rescue is less ambiguously ground. And what we've heard there is that the incident commander and the search manager jointly come to determination as to what resource might be helpful. So, for instance, if they come to the decision that air support is necessary, that's the decision they make. You're not suggesting that or maybe you are, that say a civil servant in an office in St. John's would be better placed to make that determination than would the search manager and the incident manager actually on the ground in an area they presumably know quite well.
No, I mean, again, this is a procedural issue that is very unambiguous, if I might say, in that scenario that you just put on the table. Clearly, the relationship between the police and the JRCC would come into play. That the JRCC would probably be the first point of entry on this one. That's what I'm expecting from a procedural standpoint. In the case of Red Indian Lake, obviously there's no Coast Guard resources or Coast Guard mandate to be in a place like that. But it could very well be that a marine resource in the form of a fast rescue craft or any other equipment, facilities, and so on that Coast Guard could have. But then that direction to proceed, once a humanitarian case was open and it was determined by the JRCC that they would be proceeding, if there was that kind of a need, that's clearly at the purview and the discretion, not of, and should not be, whether it's a civil servant in St. John's or otherwise. This is clearly at the purview of a Joint Rescue Coordination Center coordinator who may very well call me as a maritime rescue coordinator and say, hey, we're looking for one of your FRCs or one of your mobile units or whatever the case might be. Then it would be up to me to respond to that need that's been identified and requested from a JRCC point of view.
I guess I would just push you a little further on that, Mr. Wiseman, because the system as I understand it now for ground search and rescue is that the people on the ground, whether that would be Barry Anderson and Corporal Anstey on the ground in Makovic, or the other officers we've heard on the ground in Red Indian Lake, would determine on the ground what resource is most useful to them, and at that point, the RCMP would make a request for air support. You don't have an issue with that particular model, I take it?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I guess if you're going to look at, again, this, the command and control process, even in a command and control process where there's mandate from a Joint Rescue Coordination Center coordinator or a maritime coordinator, I mean, one of the very first things you do is to establish that on-scene commander, that incident commander. And you take, even at sea, you take quite often your direction from that appointment of the on-scene commander that's there. Oftentimes the need is identified by that on-scene commander. So that's very critical, and I certainly wouldn't want to see or even suggest that we should move away from that in any fashion to have a different kind of a regime structure that would override that important piece of on-scene.
Okay, because that leads to my next question. The reality, what we have now is that the RCMP officer, perhaps through an intermediate RCMP officer, but places a call to what is now emergency measures, and essentially says we need air support for this this search in Red Indian Lake or Makovic or wherever the case might be, and the process goes to emergency measures. And what we've further heard is emergency measures then in what appear to be, from the case studies we've looked at, very quick turnovers, 2 minutes here or 3 minutes there, maybe 5 or 7 minutes, place a call to JRCC. So I guess what I'm saying, putting to you, is the mechanism, the arrangement that's currently in place for ground search and rescue up to the point of calling JRCC would appear to be, I would suggest, a fairly timely movement from the point of the person on the ground thinking a search is necessary, or rather air support is necessary, to a call being placed to JRCC. Do you see that model as being problematic the way it's operating now, up to the point the call is made to JRCC?
Yeah, I'd see, and I think I've said before that there's some time lapses that could creep in there. There are some influences that could creep in there that would ultimately determine whether or not that particular resource that's being requested gets turned down. That was, the point that I made, that if the coordination of that incident were to fall with the rescue coordinator at the JRCC, with the full empowerment and the level of authority that's there, that first off, the whole situational awareness, including the situational awareness of all the resources and all the best resources, is really at the fingertips of the Joint Rescue Coordination Center coordinator.
But that's because you're a federal employee with a federal range of assets at your fingertips.
Exactly.
If absent being having a range of such asset at your fingertips, you don't disagree in principle that there has to be a clearinghouse provincially where a decision can be made whether to access provincial assets or provincially contracted assets or federal assets. I guess what I'm saying to you, if we have a model where the province lacks a primary fleet, can you not see why it is necessary to have an emergency measures as a clearinghouse?
Well, it's what we have. It's the reality of what we have. Do we continue with that, or do we have some other kind of collaborative arrangement through MOU to have a very quick line of requests for resources to support an incident directly from the police, right directly to the JRCC, and the JRCC then, actions an open case and takes on the full responsibility of making that full assessment. The route that we have now, if we follow it, and quite often, I'm sure it's quite efficient, and quite often that clearinghouse, if you will, of resource that's available might in fact solve the situation that's needed. But there quite often the case comes where that real specialized resource, it could be a cormorant, for example, as it often is absolutely necessary. So when the JRCC gets it, and because it comes from a ground search and rescue in a humanitarian situation, that there is another level of dilution that occurs from the point of view of the rescue coordinator, who's then no longer got the authority that I explained in the Canada Shipping Act to act and proceed, but then he's got to start to look through his chain of command and have a briefing and have a discussion on whether or not this is the right resource to send, and chain of command sometimes will elevate itself through different process, causing unnecessary delays, and influences where the resource may not be actioned.
So would it be fair to sum up your evidence, and if it's not fair, do tell me, as the submission in a nutshell is saying that there should either be a provincial resource, there should either be provincially owned or contracted resources that can respond to any range of ground search and rescue situations, including 24/7 air support, or there should be an MOU that would allow the officers in the field to perhaps directly or almost directly reach out to JRCC and have the same ability to access those assets as you would have had in your capacity as a Marine Search and Rescue Coordinator.
Yes, you know, you've put it properly. There's no question, and I think we've seen testimony and presentations throughout the week to indicate that that there is a shortcoming. More often not that there is a shortcoming, especially when you consider night flights and specialized equipment and things that you know, that if that shortcoming is going to be made up, obviously there's consequence from a financial standpoint and so on. But I think clearly the presentation that we saw yesterday, the two presentations from Kruger and Pell, becomes very relevant. You know, if it continues to be an aggravating situation, that the kind of resources that the province would want to requisition in its current framework is not readily available in an efficient and acceptable way that will give that level of service, then it's either replace it or we continue with the situation that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Wiseman. I have no further questions for you. However, I would imagine other council will. Do you wish to go next, Mr. Ralph?
Commissioner, the province has no questions. I'd like to thank Mr. Wiseman. Really appreciate your comments, and I think they'll be very helpful. Thank you.
No, Mr. Commissioner, thank you. Appreciate your presentation, Mr. Wiseman, so thank you very much.
Mr. Wiseman, I just have one area I'd like to address, and I think it's been probably echoed throughout this inquiry, and as well as, you know, in preparation for the inquiry, discussing with other people involved in both the federal system and the provincial system. And during the course of just this conversation this morning, I wrote down some of the words, the language that we're using. And the language is collaboration, communication, coordination, cooperation, it all starts to start with a C. But that is language we're hearing repetitively throughout the last 4 weeks. It was summed up in a rather simplistic manner yesterday by Edna Winters in saying, it seems like everybody's in the sandbox, but nobody's playing together. And I just wonder, because I am aware that in a number of years ago that there had been a group formed through JRCC, if I'm not mistaken, whereby, and I'm talking extended number of years ago, and maybe while you were there, maybe not, but it was an effort made to bring all the players together. And when I say all the players, we're talking police forces. So we got the RNC and the RCMP. We have provincial sources being it was EMO, it's EMS now, if I'm not mistaken, or proper acronym. ESD, I'm sorry, trying to keep it straight. We have Ground Search and Rescue here, NL-SARA, and we have obviously DND. And everybody seems to be looking to accomplish the best system available. But because of, you know, federal, provincial, jurisdictional issues, it doesn't seem like that always happens. And we don't need to go into details. We've heard it, you know, throughout the course of the inquiry of how that there can be, you know, gaps in those areas. Are you aware of any efforts or any formulation of what I'm thinking of is a working group to address the issues? I mean, obviously the inquiry doesn't have control of mandating things in federal jurisdiction, but the Commissioner has already alluded to on a number of occasions the province being able to make recommendations to work with their federal counterparts. Is there anything in place whereby all these players sit down and address issues? And I don't mean once, I mean on a regular basis, because this system we've seen is made up of, you know, 4 or 5 moving parts, and I have yet to hear anything whereby they're all in one room talking quarterly about the system. I mean, Harry Blackmore can identify, as well as Mr. Smith has identified, you know, every single search and rescue mission has deficiencies, and that's the nature of the beast. But it seems to me, and I know I'm giving a bit of a speech here, but it seems to me, is this an area that's lacking, or is this something that we should be looking at? Because everybody wants the best, but it doesn't seem like we're all pulling on the same rope.
Yeah, I mean, that's that's a toughie for me. I mean, it just goes beyond my level of expertise is the right way to put it. But I mean, I'm certainly taking stock of presentations that's been made here this week by Mr. Smith and in particular Harry. And I know that Mr. Blackmore has got some past experiences trying to achieve that level of collaboration from a federal standpoint, interprovincial, call it what you like. And I think Mr. Smith has really highlighted and illustrated the need, as you have with your statement. I'm not aware of any group that or any effort to do that. It's clearly needed. I mean, I've often said, shouldn't there be an oversight group, a search and rescue oversight arrangement framework where we can achieve the kinds of things that you reference. In my mind, there should be, and I don't know why there's an absence of that. Even addressing issues and grievances, for example, from the public about search and rescue. I mean, why is it that we have to wait for an inquiry to correct the course, to adjust our course on where we should be? That's a long time. I mean, the time lag between 2012 and the Burton Winters tragedy and today is, well, you do the math, it's 9 years. We really have no mechanism to address the issues and grievances and to make the kinds of corrections that the family would want to see or that the public would want to see in the interests of preventing this in the future. So, I mean, I can come up with all kinds of ideas on how to do that, but quite simply, there is an absence of it right now. And I know I don't want to discredit some efforts where levels of debriefing has occurred or where levels of special operations report, SAR operations report, what they try to achieve, debriefing, immediate debriefing with different players on major cases and so on and so forth. I don't want to discredit that. And I know, because I think everybody, I really believe that the intent and really the goodwill of everybody who were there would like to achieve the kinds of things that you flagged there, but we just continue to come up with that level of frustration of being able to make it function in a functional kind of a way. That's why, in part, I reference the high level of collaboration and arrangements and frameworks in an international search and rescue arena. In treaties and bilateral agreements and all this, we seem to be able to achieve that pretty good. But we don't seem, from my observations and everything I see, we don't seem to be able to do the same thing interprovincially, which is rather strange.
And maybe I could throw it out, because we do have, in fairness, we do have active participants. Maybe Mr. Rumbold or Sergeant Williams or Mr. Blackmore can comment as to whether or not any such group exists currently, or any benefits that you would see in terms of the formulation of such a working group going forward.
Good morning, Commissioners. Mitch Rumbold here from the Emergency Services Division. So I guess basically, as I alluded to yesterday in reference to my relationship with Cougar, that applies to almost any government entity. I have the means and ability to contact the officer in charge of JRCC casually at any moment, any time of day. The same would apply to Sergeant Williams, the same would apply to Mr. Blackmore, or any other colleagues in any other avenue. While it's an informal process, I take that to be almost more timely and more efficient, because we don't have to wait for a scheduled meeting. We don't have to wait to get together face to face. If an issue or a concern arises, we address it right at that moment, as soon as practical to an event having concluded, and see what we can do then to prevent that from occurring in the future.
Yes, Sergeant Williams here.
Oh, there you go.
So I guess the conclusion of our searches that we perform with the GSAR teams as well, there is a look in at what could have been improved. I guess the different levels at which things can be improved. It might be on the ground or it might be in terms of resources. But as Mr. Rumbold alluded to, there are those open avenues, externally to those other partners to also discuss those. There have been a few over the years that myself and specifically Mr. Blackmore have spoken about and addressed those or made things a little more clear moving forward. So I guess from that standpoint, there is that consultation that happens from the ground, and then that open communication that's able to happen, I guess, upward and outward to external partners and internal partners as well.
Mr. Williams, I'll just add from the federal perspective, so there is the National Search and Rescue Secretariat, which comes under public safety, and they're responsible for managing and coordinating Canada's search and rescue with provincial, federal, and territorial partners. And they're interested in interoperability and multi-jurisdictional efforts being facilitated. So those communications between the province and the federal government would likely take place under the auspices of that, the National Search and Rescue Secretariat, which is part of Public Safety Canada.
Just to start off with this, there was a group put together. It was the National Search and Rescue Secretariat that was put together after the Ocean Ranger disaster. They did try to have meetings throughout different times of the year. They did do one a few years, about 6-7 years ago now, that they brought everybody from across Canada together to debate the search and rescue aspect of the provincial, federal, and everything else. And I mean, everybody was there, from the admirals of JRCCs, the admiral from Canadian Forces, the actual minister was there, and everybody else. By the time the report got out, and I know this very well, and I may get a smack for saying it, but the report was watered down that much. After the 5th revision, it finally did come out, which didn't address a big lot. But NSS was the avenue for all of us at the time. It has now since been watered down since it went under public safety. It was under D&D, where it worked very well, in my opinion. But due to different avenues, I guess, governments changed it around. But there are meetings that need to be happening. But you have to understand, too, that when everybody's together, they don't want to hurt each other's feelings, I guess I'll put it down, though. I don't know if the full through actually comes out. And as to putting it together, we do try to get together with everybody, especially in this province, as much as we can. There are more meetings probably needed to take the search and rescue aspect of it, especially for ground, because that's what we're talking about pretty well here in this province, because the federal assets take care of the marine and then aeronautical. But meetings are needed. We have brought it up. It has been brought up again lately, and hopefully to work with Justice to be able to set up some type of meeting that would take this fashion. And as Mr. Wiseman said, there's a lot of different things and moving parts in this, but every time you bring up a problem, if it involves search and rescue nationally with us, it's always, no, it's the right of the province and territory. They take care of ground search and rescue, so we can't discuss it. But it needs to be discussed, and the interdepartmental search and rescue secretariat at that time, at least they did bring all the avenues together, and it is still needed. Now that Public Safety Canada actually runs it, I don't think it'll ever happen again. But that was the avenue to bring everybody together nationwide to discuss air, marine, and ground search and rescue. And pretty well ground search and rescue as we run it here is exactly the way it's run across the country. Not much difference. But meetings, the more meetings we have on this, or an avenue to that if somebody has a problem to be able to go to the person that we're hopefully directing to, makes it easier. But as like in government, people move around, so things change. And you may be dealing with the same person for a while, everything is going along, and then all of a sudden stuff will change, and then you get to educate somebody else. So there's a lot of information needs to be passed on. I think the only way you will do it is with such a meeting at least twice a year to bring everybody together and be able to express their opinions on it. Thank you.
Questions?
If there's nothing arising or you've nothing, Mr. Commissioner, perhaps we could, I realise we're on a relative tight time schedule this morning, but if we can take a couple of minutes now, just so I can speak to Mr. O'Keefe and one other potential witness this morning.
Yes, I think the discussion between yourself and Mr. O'Keefe must also include Mr. Williams. Any testimony that we hear will have to pass the test of being trauma-informed. We're not here to add any grief to the family, so that we look very carefully about what next might be said, but clearly Mr. Williams has to have a say at the beginning as to whether or not it is advisable. So, yeah, so 10 minutes, we'll be back to continue. I got to leave around 20 after 11.
Thank you.
All rise. Thank you. All rise. This Commission of Inquiry is now in session. Please be seated.
You may proceed, Mr. Budden or Mr. Williams.
Perhaps I'll speak briefly. We have had some good discussions with Mr. Williams, with the family, with Ms. Bradley's customary help, and with Mr. O'Keefe and Captain Bartlett. How we are going to proceed is, rather than give a viva voce evidence, Captain Bartlett has spoken twice and helpfully, and we understand that he will now prepare with council a statement that will most likely be submitted and considered as evidence, but he will not be speaking here today. So that being the case, I'll hear from other council on that, and then perhaps we can talk very briefly about how tomorrow will proceed.
Thank you very much, and go ahead, council.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And I think Mr. Budden has accurately reflected the feelings. The family are very happy that there's been a concerned citizens group provided with an opportunity to express their opinions and concerns, and that the Commission has facilitated that, and they're satisfied with proceeding in that manner.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're in agreement to proceed in that fashion. We'll submit any additional written submissions that Mr. Captain Bartlett was just to make to the Commission.
I don't know, Mr. Ralph or Federal Council have anything to add to that.
No, we support your approach, Inquiry Council. Thank you very much for taking that all under consideration and proceeding in that manner. We think that's very appropriate.
Thank you. And Mr. Ralph?
That's fine, thank you.
Thanks. A couple of other matters before we conclude here today. Our plan for tomorrow, a fixed plan, is to have a round table commencing at 1:30 that will bring in some people we've heard from before, some new people, and that will be fairly, and Mr. Michael Clear will facilitate that. I'll be, as will all council, I think, will be somewhat in the background, and we'll hear directly from the search and rescue community and people who can contribute to that discussion. So I'm looking forward to that. One other bit of business tomorrow will be Casera. We're meeting with Casera tonight. They will be giving a presentation tomorrow. I would guess, based on past matters, we're looking at an hour max. The question we have, the Commissioner and I just discussed, and we're putting it out there for consideration. Do we start at our usual time of, say, 9, break at 10 and come back at 1:30? Do we come later in the morning, break and come back at 1:30, or do we simply start, say, at 12:30 and carry on through the afternoon? It's a bit of an unusual time to start, but it does have some advantages. So I guess the starting point, I would suggest we start at maybe 12:30 and hear from Casera, then break for a couple of minutes, then get the round table up and running. However, that's just a suggestion. What do other council think of that?
Commissioner, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how tomorrow is working in terms of roundtable. I don't know, have I received an email or something about what the plan is for tomorrow afternoon? Because I'm not familiar with the plans.
I can talk a bit more about that. Other people may. We've had discussions about it. What what we're envisioning is a round table that will include the members of the search and rescue community who are here today: Mr. Rumbold, Mr. Williams, Mr. Blackmore, Mr. Smith, Ms. Bradley, and a couple of others, with perhaps council, Mr. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, and perhaps council stepping back a bit. Added to that will be some other members of the search and rescue community, a couple from Bay of Islands, including Adam Godet and Gary Dalrymple and Christine Doucette. Melanie O'Brien will be back. We will be hearing possibly from Karen Didham, and also from woman Jen Gerson, who is works in search and rescue in Labrador, rather in Alberta. I may have, and we'll also be hearing from person from the School of Social Work at Memorial, from somebody from the Volunteer Bureau at Memorial, and from one or other two people from the outdoors or volunteer community. And what we envision is a discussion that's really focused around two questions. One is, given the decline in the search and rescue NL-SARA membership, which, as we've heard, is really a product of people moving out of Newfoundland and the community growing older, how best to recruit, how to appeal to perhaps members of groups that are somewhat underrepresented in the present community, and a little bit about perhaps bringing people in, say, from a social work background who might be particularly helpful given the how search and rescue, the dynamics of who is being searched is changing. And the second discussion will really be more around that, the future of search and rescue, talk a little more about the necessity of adapting to a world where perhaps the majority of the searches will become searches for individuals with mental illnesses and similar challenges rather than the traditional lost berry picker. So that will be, and that will be a more of a traditional roundtable, less of a judicial process like we're having here, but it'll be a fairly it'll be a discussion led by Michael Clare. Thank you. And so I hope you find that helpful, Mr. Ralph. And that leaves the matter of the scheduling of CASARA and whether people feel to start at 12:30, which is a bit of an awkward time to start, but it might make sense for, rather than all of us come here and then come back several hours later. Perhaps put it this way, does anybody have an issue with starting at 12:30? Would their preference be to start at 9 and then break for 3 hours or so?
Yeah, I mean, a 12:30 start is fine with me. In terms of judging how much time is required to do the work that you're anticipating, and I mean, I wouldn't be able to make comment on that, but certainly if you want me here at 12:30 and Mr. Rumble to be here at 12:30, then we'll certainly oblige.
Thank you. Counsel for the federal government?
We'd be okay with the 12:30 start as well, and that sounds fine. And Sergeant Williams is prepared to participate in that conversation roundtable as you've proposed. Am I correct in hearing that perhaps Lieutenant Colonel Marshall would not be required to be in attendance tomorrow? Is that?
I understand if he is unable to be here, and I agree that we've heard valuable evidence from him, and perhaps tomorrow, where this is really more about pretty explicitly ground search and rescue, not air support, if him being excused isn't an issue. There is the CASARA piece, but again, we've heard valuable evidence from him. We will have Mr. Williams here. So,
and thank you. So anyway,
if he is unable to be here, that's not an issue for the commission, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. And it should be, he very well may be. I just wanted to check and see if you were expecting him as part of the roundtable that you were referring to, but it sounds like not. But as you said, with the CASARA piece, it maybe that'll be a different topic that he would be more apt to be involved in. So we'll reserve on that for now.
I don't think we anticipate dragging anybody from the roundtable, but I guess certain people seem to naturally be a fit for it, and if others feel they should be there, then it's a big room.
Thank you.
Mr. O'Keefe, are you fine with the 12:30 start?
Yes, that's okay. Thank you.
Mr.
I have
Williams?
no problem for 12:30 start. I just wonder, would it make more sense if we had a 9 o'clock start and worked all the way through, and then it being the start of a long weekend, or do we have to wait till the afternoon?
We thought of that, but we're a valuable person is coming in from Alberta, and we didn't feel we could fairly ask that person to start at 5:30 a.m. And also some of the Corner Brook people, there are various people for whom the afternoon simply works better.
I have no objection, Senator.
Yeah, before Mr. Bartlett leaves, I just want to say thank you so much for having participated all along. Thank you very much from the family for taking their thoughts into consideration, and for you and Mr. Keefe to be able to still submit what you had to say. We think, I've seen your life history. I've seen how much you've accomplished, and how passionate you are about search and rescue, as well as your work with Canadian Coast Guard and Coast Guard Auxiliary. But most of all, we have to be firmly in belief that we should add no more harm to the family who have experienced so much trauma. But again, thank you for your consideration. It's really valuable that you would take that step.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think our work here is done, and perhaps we can break until tomorrow at 12:30.
All rise. This Commission of Inquiry is concluded for the day. Thank you.